For more than 2,000 years, historians have been trying to discover who he was. Sun Tzu, but this lack of answers was never a minor detail. There is no confirmed tomb, no reliable portraits, and no personal writings that reveal his private life. All that survived was a short book, transmitted almost clandestinely among military and political elites. A book that spanned dynasties, civil wars, and imperial collapses without ever losing its relevance. And that alone should raise suspicions. The art of war does not begin by extolling courage, honor, or sacrifice. She begins by treating war as a cold calculation of costs and consequences. Sun Tzu writes as someone who understands that every conflict is a bill that someone will have to pay, and that this bill almost never falls on those who decide to fight. This approach was radical in a world that glorified conquerors. While other generals sought fame and historical recognition, Sun Tzu spoke of quiet efficiency. While kings dreamed of larger territories, he warned of empty coffers. For him, bravery without planning was not a virtue, it was waste. Victory without structural gain was not victory, it was delaying collapse. Few leaders were prepared to accept this. For this reason, the book was never popular among the people. It circulated in closed circles, far from propaganda and public discourse. Emperors studied it in silence, generals applied it without citing the source. Because its ideas weakened heroic narratives and exposed internal frailties, Sun Tzu did not strengthen pride. He weakened illusions. Sun Tzu was not interested in winning isolated battles. He was interested in avoiding irreversible losses. Their true enemy was never the rival army, but the economic exhaustion caused by ambition. He understood that states don't die on the battlefield, they die later, slowly. They die when victory can no longer sustain the cost it generated, and that's the part almost no one talks about. Sun Tzu emerged in a deeply fragmented China, where small states were almost constantly vying for territory, not out of sophisticated strategic ambition, but for immediate political survival. These wars were neither quick nor decisive, but long, costly, and repetitive, creating a continuous cycle of economic attrition. The real danger came not only from the external enemy, but from the cumulative effect of these campaigns on the population and the state coffers. Rulers believed they were strengthening their power while, in practice, they were accelerating their own downfall. War was less an instrument of conquest and more a mechanism of slow impoverishment. Maintaining an army during that period meant supporting thousands of men for months or years, often far from their home regions. It was necessary to secure food, transportation, weapons, animals, and officers, all of which had to be extracted from an already fragile economy. To finance this effort, taxes were aggressively increased, putting pressure on peasants and merchants. The result was predictable: a drop in productivity, famine, internal revolts, and a loss of legitimacy for the ruler. War destroyed the state even before it destroyed the enemy. There are historical records of kingdoms that won important battles and expanded their territory, only to collapse shortly afterward. Military victory did not solve the structural problems left by debt and the exhaustion of the population. The army returned victorious, but found an impoverished and unstable country. The ruler's prestige was short-lived in the face of real scarcity. Glory was brief, but the cost remained. Sun Tzu observed this pattern repeatedly throughout his life. He saw leaders confuse victory with sustainability, failing to realize they were merely postponing collapse. He understood that war functioned as an economic trap disguised as power. The more a state fought, the more vulnerable it became in the long run. It was a paradox that few dared to admit. It was in this environment that Sun Tzu wrote his work, not as a manual for conquest, but as a silent warning. He did not want to teach how to fight better, but how to avoid the kind of victory that destroys the victor. Its focus was not on expanding borders, but on preserving the state's ability to continue existing. The art of war, therefore, emerges from a China that was learning to fail through fighting, and from a thinker who decided to treat war as an economic problem before anything else. The most famous episode involving Sun Tzu was not recorded by chance, because it reveals in a raw way how his thinking worked when placed under real pressure. A king decided to test him by handing him 180 concubines from the palace, not as royal soldiers, but as a staged event intended to ridicule his ideas. The order was simple: transform them into a disciplined unit, something everyone there believed to be impossible. The test wasn't military, it was political, because the king expected Sun Tzu to fail publicly, and Sun Tzu realized this from the start. When orders were given and met with laughter and disobedience, Sun Tzu did not react with irritation or improvisation, but with explanation. He stated that when instructions are clear and not followed, The fault lies not with the troops, but with the leadership and command structure. He repeated the orders even more clearly, making the consequences explicit. Even so, the indiscipline continued. At that moment, the test ceased to be symbolic. The decision that followed shocked the court and has stood for centuries as an extreme example. Sun Tzu ordered the execution of two of the king's favorite concubines, ignoring attempts at intervention. It was not an act of emotional cruelty, but a cold demonstration of causality. Error generates cost, disorganization generates losses, tolerance of indiscipline generates collapse. The objective was not to punish, but to teach. The effect was immediate and absolute. The unit began to obey with mechanical precision, proving that the problem was never capacity, but structure. Sun Tzu demonstrated that discipline is not born from speeches, but from clear consequences. The lesson was not about violence, but about avoiding future mistakes. Each mistake avoided represented resources preserved. After completing the test, Sun Tzu refused permanent positions and proximity to power. He knew that generals who were too close to kings lost the ability to speak unpopular truths. His method demanded intellectual independence, not flattery. Rulers feared him because he promised no glory, only survival. And surviving, in that world, was rarer than winning. Throughout his work, Sun Tzu repeatedly returns to the same warning, insisting that long campaigns destroy nations even when they end in victory. The cost doesn't appear immediately, but accumulates silently while leaders are distracted by apparent achievements. Soldiers become worn down, production chains break down, and the domestic economy begins to falter. Victory on the battlefield creates a false sense of security, and it is precisely at this moment that the collapse begins to take shape. Sun Tzu describes the depletion of resources with impressive accuracy for someone writing centuries before economics existed as a science. He talks about increased costs, difficulty in replacement, loss of productivity, and pressure on the civilian population. He shows that war forces the state to consume the future to sustain the present. Each prolonged campaign anticipates crises that are not yet visible, and the later they appear, the more destructive they become. For Sun Tzu, destroying the enemy was rarely the best solution. The ideal enemy should be absorbed, keeping their cities functioning and their population productive. Destroyed wealth cannot be taxed, exploited, or integrated. Devastated territory generates costs, not power. Economic preservation was, therefore, a strategic weapon. This reasoning reveals an extremely modern view of power. Sun Tzu understood that governing ruins requires more force than governing intact structures. A state that inherits a functional economy also inherits stability. A state that inherits destruction inherits revolt and scarcity. The difference between lasting rule and rapid collapse lies precisely there. Therefore, winning without fighting occupied the top of their strategic hierarchy, not out of moral idealism or pacifism, but out of cold financial rationality. The best victory is the one that preserves resources, population, and productive capacity. It is the victory that does not require subsequent reconstruction. And, above all, it is the victory that does not charge interest in the future. More than 2,000 years later, Sun Tzu remains relevant because its logic still governs power decisions, even when its name is not mentioned. Companies, governments, and investors instinctively repeat these principles, trying to avoid protracted conflicts that drain resources. Price wars, endless political disputes, and emotional financial decisions follow the same pattern of attrition. The landscape changes, but the structure of the problem remains identical. Those who ignore costs tend to confuse movement with progress. Modern countries learn this lesson the hard way. Wars can be won militarily, but they are almost never paid for economically. Reconstruction costs more than conquests, and debts survive conflicts. Real power arises from stability, not from displays of force, and this difference rarely appears in official speeches. In the financial world, Sun Tzu's logic is even more evident. Experienced investors prioritize capital preservation before seeking aggressive returns. They understand that survival is the basic condition for any future victory. Avoiding irreversible losses is more important than seeking one-off gains, exactly as Sun Tzu described centuries ago. What makes his legacy unsettling is the fact that he dismantles heroic narratives. Sun Tzu shows that strength without resources is an illusion, and that courage without calculation is a waste. He exposes the fragility of empires that expand without economic support, showing that many victories are merely postponed defeats, and that the cost always exacts interest in the end. Perhaps that is why his work was never popular with the general public. It does not feed pride, does not promise glory, and does not celebrate empty sacrifices. It teaches limits, calculation, and restraint, rare virtues in times of ambition. Sun Tzu did not teach how to conquer the world. He taught how not to lose it after the conquest.